are back on the 0 Hour. As always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. What is this pandemic doing to us as a people? What is this pandemic doing to those who are already suffering before it even came along? How are the deaths of working people and poor people and other people under duress, how are their lives and deaths being affected by this pandemic? We're going to be researching that question for, I suspect, many months and years to come. But my next guest has written a piece about it that I thought was provocative and well worth talking about. She's been on the program before. I always look forward to talking to her. Lynn Parramore is an author and a cultural critic. She is also a research analyst at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And her most recent piece, let me make sure I get the headline right, Epidemic of Despair Could Haunt America Long After COVID. So first of all, Lynn, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite places to hash out what's going on in the world.
Well, we always love hashing it out with you. In this case, though, obviously a very grim topic. And, I would say you touch on a number of issues in this, but I would say maybe your taking off point, as suggested in your title, are the deaths of despair that we were already seeing on the rise in this country before the pandemic. So, and of course, the deaths of despair being, we've had Ann Case on the program talking about Ann Case and Angus Deaton, the economist, talking, quantifying the deaths we've seen among the white working class in this case, and that plus other factors, as you mentioned, reducing the lifespan in the United States. I guess before we begin talking about the pandemic's effect on death, both for this population and others, and life, maybe we should start with what are the salient facts you think the general public ought to know about the deaths of despair as they existed before the pandemic, sort of kind of give us a baseline.
Yeah, for just a little bit of background, the year 2015 was the year that this very interesting study came out by Case and Deaton, these Princeton economists whom you've spoken to before, and they were noticing an increase in suicide, alcohol-related deaths, and drug overdoses among midlife white men and women without college educations. And this was interesting for a number of reasons. These folks as a group may have had higher incomes than, let's say, Hispanics in that same category, without college educations. But they were they were reporting a feeling of a downward trajectory, a kind of sense of chronic loss, a feeling that they just couldn't cope with work and a general feeling of decline in their lives, declining in their health, decline in their expectations. So that was a notable thing, and these two economists coined the term. I believe they're the ones that first used the term "deaths of despair." So in 2015, 2016, and 2017, the United States reported an overall decrease in life expectancy, with those deaths of despair certainly contributing to that drop. And just to put it in perspective, that hadn't happened since the Spanish flu, since our last major pandemic. So it was quite a notable phenomenon. That's not supposed to happen in wealthy countries. Right. And the other thing that they noted was that there was a real disturbing divergence among life expectancies, among the less affluent declining, while those among the very most affluent were going through the roof. They were living it up and living much longer. And this phenomenon was very, very much prevalent in the United States. The United States was a standout. So something was going on, not just all over the world, but it was going on especially here. So that's kind of what we were seeing. Shannon Manatt, who is a grantee of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, as well as a sociologist at Syracuse University, has been deaths of despair, particularly the drug overdoses. So she was looking at the opioid crisis before the pandemic started, which Case and Deaton identified as one of the major factors driving those deaths of despair. They also mentioned job instability, some of the hangovers from the Great Recession, shredded safety nets, globalization, but the opioid crisis was also a major factor. And Manat was looking at the populations that seemed to be vulnerable. And again, it was white, working class folks who were living in a couple of different kinds of areas. Rural areas where there was a decline in manufacturing jobs, and those that were based on mining. You know, you think about Appalachia, those regions were hit hard. And it was interesting because she saw that in communities that were kind of built around farming, they tended to have a little more social cohesion, a little more in the way of resources to combat the kinds of instability that the Great Recession caused. Even factors like going to church or participating in sporting events. Interestingly, Manat found, you know, created social cohesion that gave you a little protective factors when, you know, the drug reps and the drug dealers came to town.
Right.
But she definitely Manat found that inequality in the United States and policies that had blocked access to health care, policies that failed to promote secure and decently paid jobs, were in place in ways that made these populations more vulnerable to drug overdose. So the pharmaceutical reps, yes, they were greedy, they were doing horrible things, they were pushing drugs that they knew were addictive, but they got a lot more purchase in areas where there was more insecurity, more downward mobility, more feelings of economic despair and distress. So, you know, it didn't just happen. Bad policies sort of primed the situation. Another set of rural areas that she found were vulnerable were those that relied on kind of insecure, crappy service industry jobs. That was another place where you found people more vulnerable to drug overdoses. So that's kind of the picture we were looking at prior to the pandemic. Increases in drug overdoses had been occurring across populations after the Great Recession, although more among this white non-college educated group, but it was higher among all populations.
And I just want to take a detour. Thank you for that, Lynn. And I just want to take a detour for a second for context in all of this. Because the fact, for example, that right now you and I are talking about white rural populations primarily, you know, there is by no means to downplay the significance of the suffering among populations of color or urban populations and the overlap thereof. But I think sometimes I've experienced pushback on this discussion by people who say, you know, why do you do that? And I think it comes in to a certain extent out of a kind of zero-sum view of the competing groups in this country, or the differentiated groups. I wouldn't call them competing. They shouldn't compete, but a kind of sense that, you know, if I belong to population A in the city, why should I care about what's happening to population B in the country? Maybe, if anything, there'll be more resources for us. But that's, to me, it's a holistic, it fails to recognize the holistic view of the economy, that if one group is in decline, first of all, social cohesion is collapsing, which is bad for everyone. But secondly, it's a bad economic indicator, in my view, for everyone, white and black,
Yeah.
urban, rural. But, you know, I just wanted to inject that in there and see what your thoughts were as well.
That's a good point to make. And Manat actually found there were some urban populations that were particularly hard hit by the rise in drug overdoses. And it sort of depends on the conditions in those urban areas, and urban areas in which there was more poverty, less in the way of social protection, social safety net, access to healthcare. Those were the ones that were going to be hardest hit by the pandemic. So whoever we are, white, black, young, old, male, female, whatever your gender, when certain conditions are in place, that cause economic and social distress, the drug overdoses are going to go up. And as Shannon pointed out, all populations across race and gender were seeing increases in drug overdose. It was somewhat higher among this white population, but it was going up among Black communities. It was going up among college educated communities as well. So this was something that was the deaths of despair were impacting basically everyone except the rich.
Right. And that word despair is important to me too, because you get this, particularly I think conservative, but not exclusively, pushback that says, well, the poor people in this country have it pretty good. They can get food stamps. I saw a poor person with a color TV or a cell phone or what have you. And I think the operative, besides the just brute insensitivity of the comments, the operative notion of despair, and you've used the word decline several times, that when you see your financial security declining, your income declining, your community declining, your family declining, that's a particularly acute kind of despair. You may have enough to eat to survive today, for example. You may have a roof over your head today, but the sense of decline, you don't know where the decline is going to end. That creates despair, fear, and perhaps a desire to escape. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, if you think about the American dream and its promise, it's that, we will be able to give our children a better life than we had. There will be improvements. There will be opportunities to rise up the socioeconomic ladder. And that's what has been decimated in the last few decades of really ill-conceived economic policies driven by a neoliberal perspective. And that kind of feeling that no matter what I do, I can't seem to make anything better. I don't have a better future to look forward to. I don't know if I can afford to give my kids a decent education, and the sense of futility that comes with that, and probably a sense of shame and a feeling that your status is being lost. All of that makes people very upset and often angry. And we've seen some of this play out in Donald Trump's ability to connect with people who were feeling so much pain. That's a very dangerous thing that can happen in our society. So yes, I think it is a particular kind of despair. That's the kind of despair that can drive you to suicide, that can drive you to become addicted to alcohol or to drugs. And it's a kind of pain that we haven't been paying enough attention to. And some of the populations that were already experiencing this kind of pain before the pandemic are experiencing an amplification. And along with that, populations that might have been doing a little better, comparatively speaking, before the pandemic, they are now falling into despair. So we're having the despair is like a contagion, and like the virus, it's spreading.
How much do we know, Lynn Parramore, at this point? I mean, and for many of us, we're, as we approach the 1 year mark of this pandemic, or basically there already, it seems endless, right? It seems like forever. But from a social science point of view, it's not very long. It's still, we don't even have 12 months of data collected. We probably don't have 6 months of good data collected. Where are we in terms of your understanding, in terms of, let's start with sort of quantified research on the effects of the pandemic?
It's a short period of time, and you're exactly right. There are a lot of questions. There's a lot of data being collected that hasn't been processed. It's hard for sociologists to get a hold of, sort of granular data on deaths and breakdown of gender and race and all that sort of thing. But here are some things that we do know. In a very short period of time, a year, some really alarming things have happened. Drug overdose fatalities have happened at an increase of 30, 40, 50% in many communities. That's a lot. We've actually seen rates of drinking increase among the population. There was a study that came recently recently, which showed that women in particular are binge drinking at higher rates, 41% higher rate of binge drinking before the pandemic. Now, that's troubling for many reasons, partly because women, mothers in particular, they are taking a lot of Xanax and prescription medications that mix with alcohol, and especially in the binge drinking context, that can kill you. So, and we're seeing a lot of statistics coming in the last couple of weeks that are really alarming. 50%, 57% labor participation among women, which is a 30-year low. That's an alarming statistic. Some research has been done by sociologists showing that the experience of women, working mothers in particular during the pandemic, is rolling back all kinds of social and cultural progress on their workforce participation, their work-life balance. Just a couple of statistics. 80% of mothers are reporting that they're primarily responsible for housework since last March, 80%, and 66% of the working mothers say that they're chiefly responsible for childcare. So that's obviously, we've got a perfect storm brewing, right, in many of these populations. So those numbers are very alarming. So what Shannon Manette has found is that since the pandemic, you've got not only the people who are already vulnerable to the deaths of despair, but you've got two populations that she's particularly concerned about. One are urban Black populations, where you had people who had drug users who had reliable supplies before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the pandemic has created disruptions in the drug supply chain, illegal drug supply chain, just like it's created problems with toilet paper.
Right.
People can't get the drugs that they expect to get in the way they expect to get them. And fentanyl is a major, major problem. The painkiller fentanyl, which, the pharmaceutical kind, is used, to treat severe pain, but the illegal kind is very lethal. It doesn't respond as well to Narcan, the overdose drug. It's mixed in with all kinds of things, and people don't know what they're getting. They may think they're getting an oxy pill on the street. Instead, they're getting fentanyl. And
just so you know, Lynn Parramore, yeah, I lost a very close family member to a fentanyl overdose. And so I still get a little bit of always will, I guess, a little stab when it comes up. And he basically, I think he thought he was buying a street Xanax, and obviously had an addiction problem. Well, it shouldn't be a death sentence in any decent society. And so in addition to the kind of, lasting heartbreak that these deaths cause, my sense is that each of them, particularly in troubled communities, amplifies the very despair that brought on the death to begin with, a kind of a vicious circle of despair bringing on deaths bringing on additional despair. Does that make sense to you as well?
Yes. Just before I came on the program, and I'm so sorry to hear about your friend. Just
family member, actually. Yeah.
Family member is.
Yeah.
I was reading this morning about parents of a teenage girl in Oklahoma who died of a fentanyl overdose. She thought she was buying, an oxy pill, and it turned out to be fentanyl, and it killed her. It's an extremely painful subject, and it's such a dangerous product. I mean, just for the context of viewers, it's 50% more potent than heroin, and it's 80 to 100% stronger than morphine. So this is an extremely powerful drug. During the pandemic, there are a lot of factors that make it even more lethal than it would normally be, because people are using drugs alone more. So you don't have a friend nearby who could take you to the hospital or try to revive you. You don't maybe have access to your normal drug treatment programs. Telehealth and all these kinds of things, they're complicated. They don't really work so well for many populations. Maybe your local nonprofit is shut down, and your syringe program, you can't access it. So there's so many disruptions that people who use these drugs are experiencing that make them much more dangerous. And there's a lot of terribly tragic loss of life.
So all of this, Lynn Parramore, is sad and troubling. Are there, of course, are there any, and I deeply fear for these and other reasons that we have yet to grasp the long-term threats and social damage and implications for the future of this pandemic. I feel as if we're just beginning to, a lot of people are, well, it'll be over in a few months. Well, I think we're dealing with deeply lasting damage, particularly to me, potentially threatening our coherence as a society. Maybe I'm being too grim. So I guess I would ask you, number one, your thoughts about that, and two, any thoughts you have if people have had good suggestions for how to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we keep hearing that term long hauler to describe people who've had the virus but can't seem to shake the symptoms, and it goes on for months and months and months. There's a sense in which our society is going to be suffering long haul effects, and this is very real. And I do think it's been underplayed in the media so far. We're just starting to talk about it more. I mean, when you think about deaths of despair, if you're increasing your alcohol use during COVID, the effects of that may not show up for 10 years or more. You end up with cirrhosis of the liver. That's going to kill you long after the immediate crisis of the pandemic ends. And all of these women who have had to leave the workforce, I mean, they're not getting promotions. There was a study this morning that showed that I was looking at that showed that female academics, their research hours have gone down compared to their male colleagues. They're not publishing as much. These all have long-term impacts on our society in ways that are really disturbing and damaging. And these communities that were already, they hadn't ever really recovered from the Great Recession, and now they've gotten hit again. I mean, this is going to have a long, long lasting effect. And in terms of what to do about it, well, we're going to have to think transformatively. And this is one of the reasons I like coming on this program, because we're able to talk big, because it does require big thinking. The fact of the matter is, we've seen that our current economic system does not function in a crisis well at all. Our health system doesn't function in a crisis. So we have to make big changes. I keep going back to a fundamental thing, which has troubled me and you and others for a long time. You can have democracy, as Justice Brandeis told us, or you can have a concentration of wealth, but you can't have both.
Right.
We failed to reckon with that. We have a tax structure which is, regressive. I mean, the stock market is soaring. Rich people are doing better than ever. The social fabric is just increasingly torn apart because of that. Once again, just like the deja vu from the Great Recession, ordinary people are bearing the brunt of this. So I think you're right. There's a sense in which this will make inequality even worse, unless we get really serious and we really do start talking about transforming the tax structure, and universal health care and these things which people want, the population wants. Study after study, poll after poll says that the majority of people want some kind of single payer system, and yet politicians still act as if this is some kind of a radical idea, that the current president has been dismissive of that idea. So there are things that we can do. We know from creating the New Deal and our response to the Great Depression, we know that kind of a jobs program works. We could have an infrastructure program now that would do a lot to mitigate the damage in these communities, which have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. One of the things that Shannon Manat has been finding, she's been studying New York State, primarily central and western upstate New York. Communities that have relied on tourism and vacation and that sort of thing, they might have been doing relatively okay before the pandemic, and now they're getting slammed. They've lost season after season of tourists, et cetera. So right. Jobs programs, infrastructure program could be such an important tool to help some of these communities rebound from this unemployment, underemployment. I mean, we've got, 10% unemployment now in the country? as a, I number is even higher than the official number, as it
Right.
often is. We know how to do this. That's the good news. We do know how to do it. Can we get this through our dysfunctional political system is the question.
And I think, I wonder, and this may be getting a little afield from our topic, Lynn, but I feel as if those types of fundamental changes, universal health care, aggressive action to reduce inequality, universal jobs program, I would love, part of me would love to say, there are intermediate steps we can do that will make things okay. I'm not sure there are. And it's a little bit of a diversion, but certainly related. I'd love your thoughts on it. My feeling is we either do those big things or, this can't go on. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I tend to think that way myself. I think we're out of time for these little incremental Band-Aid types of things. What we've experienced, sociologists, Shannon Manatt, even this pandemic is something like a short war in terms of its effect on many parts of the population. And we need a big response to that. We don't need Band-Aids. We don't need little incremental changes. And it's just become absurd, really, that let's take the case of universal health care. Every time this came up during the presidential debates, some journalist on one of the networks would sort of speak dismissively about the idea. You turn to a commercial break, there's a pharmaceutical industry or an insurance company advertising. I mean, it's just, you can't have an adequate public discussion about this. Every time Bernie Sanders tried to raise the point, he's dismissed as some kind of a fringe radical, which is absolutely not true. Somebody asked me the other day, is the U.S. population more radical than their politicians? And I just think, no, they're more sensible, because that idea is not radical.
Right.
The majority of people believe that it's not only possible but necessary. Much of the world, almost every other industrialized Western country does this. Like we have got to stop being the outlier in the negative sense. We have, and similarly with the infrastructure program, we know how to do this. This is not a radical fringe kind of idea. We've done it. It works. How about expanding Social Security and Medicare?
Right.
People say, oh, what are we going to do about, the healthcare system and retirement? We already know how to do this. We know that Social Security works. The one beautiful thing about Social Security, every time there's a recession, every time there is a crisis, that check keeps on coming to people. People know that they can rely on it. Let's expand it. We don't have to create an entirely new safety net for retirees. We already have a good one, and similarly with a universal program, we already have Medicare. We don't have to invent the wheel. We know how to do these things. We just have to find the political representation willing to act in the interest of the population and hear what the population really wants.
But you know what you're going to hear, Lynn, and you work for the Institute for New Economic Thinking, among other things. Oh, we can't afford it. So,
yeah, that's the same kind of cry that we heard when Social Security was being fought
right.
for, during FDR. It's the same argument over and over. There have been, studies done. I think even the Mercatus Center, that conservative Mercatus Center, accidentally, in spite of itself, acknowledged that universal health care would actually save the economy a huge amount of money. Anybody that could try to argue that we don't have a bloated and dysfunctional healthcare system that wastes tremendous amount of money, I think that's where I don't even think the person walking down the street would believe that. Maybe a politician could try to convince you, but.
Well, what that Mercatus study, I wrote about it for the LA Times. But here's, and I don't want to open up a whole other topic on Parramore, but maybe it'll be our next conversation. But it basically found that if you took, and the numbers can be debated, but $34 trillion, I think it was, over the next 10 years, in a mixed public-private spending and put it all through single payer, all public, it would become 32 trillion, which is a savings, of course, of $2 trillion plus dollars. But what I think the psychology is that we get hamstrung by, and I think the post-epidemic despair will make it even more urgent debate, is that there's this rigid thinking about the public versus the private economy, and that somehow, yes, of course, putting all 32 trillion through the government would be a vast increase in the government's budget, but somehow people have been trained not to think about the total economy. They just think, well, we can't afford those extra trillions, as opposed to, we're taking it from the private economy where you get lousy service at very high cost. We're putting in the public economy where for lower cost, we'll say 45,000 lives a year, and most people will have vastly better coverage. People are just trained to think, well, their minds freeze at the notion of increasing the public economy. And many of these communities suffering from the deaths of despair are suspicious of government. Yeah. So, I'll give you the last word, but to me, that's the task ahead, is convincing people that the public economy is not the enemy. It's just a part of the economy, number one. And number two, government is not your enemy. We got to get that message out to some of the people who are dying.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really fundamental kind of transformative messaging and perspective that we really have to work on, because the idea, the libertarian notion that government is the enemy, Ronald Reagan, all of it has created a perception among, a whole generation that government is the enemy. But actually, government is the only thing standing in the way of complete control by corporations. And we have this bizarre sense of freedom that it's the government that curtails our freedom, when actually some people can't even take a bathroom break in their job without, somebody saying that it's okay. Now, having kind of a militarized and aggressive police force has not helped the trust in government. And having the revolving door between the private sector and government. I mean, all these things are real. The money in politics, it's all real. And yet, Thomas Piketty showed in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, that capitalism leads to the concentration of wealth, which is contrary to the aims of a democracy. And unless you have government intervention to mitigate that, you're going to have a plutocracy. That's just kind of how it is. He had reams of data, 200 years worth of data to support that claim. I mean, the only other option is to wait for something horribly cataclysmic, like a gigantic war, which can shift the balance in an economy. But let's hope we don't have to go through that much suffering to make adjustments, because I think you're right. I think that the clock is ticking on us. It's something like climate change. You can think along those lines. We don't really have forever to figure this out. We saw with the Capitol siege and the terrible outbreaks of despair and violence, the deaths of despair, the racial tension. The social unrest is brewing. And this just can't go on indefinitely. We can't have a situation where people are, the affluent are getting richer and richer while people are suffering. There's a tipping point, and I think we're getting closer to it. So let's address that problem peacefully and thoughtfully, rather than having to confront it in the midst of some horrible cataclysmic global catastrophe.
Well, you not only just offered an excellent summary, Lynn Parramore, you also expressed better than I have why this program is called the Zero Hour. So once again, Lynn Parramore, always a delight to talk to you. Thanks for writing about this critical subject. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.